I'm really excited to assist this panel in this discussion. And before I start, though, I'm going to read our acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of indigenous peoples who have traveled, lived in, and stewarded lands in Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure to get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the questions and answers. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for the questions and answers. We're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly so I can read it. If you're a student, please note this on your question on the card. When you finish, raise your hand to hand it to the producer who will bring it to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. So try to keep it to like one sentence, something that has like a beginning and an end, and make sure that it makes sense to have a question mark at the end of it. And now I'd like to do some brief introductions. So I'll talk a little bit at some of the points as well. So in my history as well, I worked in Africa for 17 years doing affordable housing and HIV and AIDS work. And really, as I was thinking about this session, really thought about the impacts that I saw there. So I'll mention a couple of those as we go along. But first I want to introduce Brian Fuentes. He's a local architect. It's nice to have someone from Boulder. We actually have expertise in Boulder. It's nice that it's recognized elsewhere. Brian's an honorary professor here at CU as well. And what I have in common with Brian is certainly my commitment to work in actioning sustainable development. He's an expert in passive house. Passive house is really, as I understand it, the highest level or approach of sustainably built buildings. What I appreciate about Brian is his ability to demonstrate the long-term energy savings that can actually offset the upfront cost of building homes to this standard. What I also share with Brian is a day just over a year ago, on December 30th, when a horrific fire devastated our community. I was working at the Operations Emergency Center and was called into this emergency to assist with providing temporary shelter for the families of the homes that had just started to burn. Later that day, I learned that my home, my wife and I bought 30 years ago, had burned. I also know that Brian and his family lost their home. He is building back with a passive home, and I am, in 2 weeks, away from completing my net zero home in Louisville. And I'm excited to share this platform with Brian and his expertise on the built environment. John Herfinen. John has tackled some of our most critical challenges of the day. He has worked to strengthen democracy and legislative processes, judicial structures, and free and fair elections. The good news is that he supported this work in Guyana. However, I'd hoped that he had been tasked with doing that here in the U.S. At the urging of Madeleine Albright, he provided support for the UN International War Crimes Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Most recently, he has led the media and advocacy work for physicians on human rights around HIV and AIDS, juvenile justice, international conflicts, landmines, and torture. A great person to have coffee with. I think he was invited here today because he is a person of many opinions. His opinions have been carried in the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, CNN, and more. I'm looking forward to his points, his input, opinions, and experience on today's topic. Rebecca Schorer has focused much of her life on helping the world's most vulnerable communities as a humanitarian professional. She has provided her leadership in more than 25 countries, covering national disasters in places like Haiti and Pakistan, with events like the tsunami in Southeast Asia. She also leads efforts in resilience for vulnerable communities that face impacts from climate change, migration, and the degradation of local environments. She is currently a senior fellow at the Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. As I was thinking about her work this morning, I was reminded by my first experience with the impacts of degradation to the environment to a local community. In 1990-91, my wife and I lived in rural Zimbabwe. The community there of subsistence farmers kept moving further and further out. They needed the trees for cooking, heat, and needed the land without trees to grow their subsistence crops. But without the trees, they also couldn't survive. I saw the challenges of a community that had totally deforested their land and impacted their ability to sustain. I'm so pleased to learn of the experience and wisdom of Rebecca as we explore the topic of managing the effects of our climate crisis. So with that, why don't we start with Brian? They're each going to make some opening remarks, and after that we'll get into some discussions, and I'll look forward to some of your questions coming forward. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. How's the audio there? Is that close enough? Tilt. Okay, there we go. Better? All right. Well, thank you. We're very honored to be here, and I felt since the recent Marshall Fire, I guess there's two of us up here that have gone through the experience. A little closer, okay. Maybe that's a little better now? Yep, okay. No, not better.
You're tall.
Keep going. Okay, how's that? All right, we got there, okay. Thank you. So, yeah, in general, I feel maybe I'm here because of the recent loss and to put some like local perspective to climate change induced kind of forced migration or movement, you know, and the trauma, even though we had insurance and we were, you know, obviously we live in an affluent community, had a lot of resources. I look at what happened in our local area, in our little community, as a kind of a microcosm for what's happening globally at the larger scale. And I think it's very interesting just to see how the governmental structures are set up right now. I feel like we're not totally ready for the tsunami coming at us, just in terms of how we're organized. But I do have faith, I think, not so much in the structures that are older, you know, our government organizations or our business organizations. These structures are kind of built on older ideas, but the human beings are very good when they just talk to each other about coming up with solutions, I think, in an informal context. So what's given me hope and faith is just human beings being able to talk to each other face to face and come up with solutions and work together. And what I struggle with, or I guess what I fear for the future, is more, can we take the inertia of our institutions and our ways of thinking, and can we transform those, you know, with compassion and listening and hard work and joy, I think, too, also, and transform our systems into something that gives equity and security and health and climate protection to everyone universally. So it's a big challenge, but I think going through it, and maybe you'd agree that you know, human beings are, in general, I feel, at least maybe I'm still an optimist, good. We're animals, and you know, we're the type of animal that has evolved to succeed by working together, not necessarily by being big or strong or fast or durable like a cockroach or a mosquito or something. But we're you know, we've worked together historically to overcome our challenges. So even though it's messy and it's kind of not very pretty at times, in terms of looking at human history and how we've treated each other, perhaps, I think there are definitely bright spots, and it gives me faith. Ironically, we work in the types of buildings we design are, you know, when I moved to Boulder to basically cater to a group of people that were able to afford and were passionate about building net zero environmental buildings, and that's changed over time. So when I first came to Boulder, it was straw bale solar buildings for people building in the mountains that were just trying to do the right thing. This is pre-LEED, if you're familiar with that building standard, kind of the first round of realizing that our buildings had an impact on the environment. That organizational standard, since then a lot has evolved, and now, you know, Passive House I think is a good energy standard. But the real connection to me when I first came to Boulder was people that were passionate about trying to do the right thing for the environment, and also I think trying to do the right thing from a social justice perspective. Although those two things were disconnected, I think, academically 20 years ago. Whereas now what I see that's exciting to me about the students in this era is that I feel like that idea is now more commonplace. Because when I was here in 2003, I heard Paul Hawkins speak to this, that, you know, environmentalism as it was known or historically done really wasn't connected with social justice. And if the environmental movement wanted to be successful in achieving its goals, it really needed to realize that it was a social justice movement, that environmental justice and social justice, we had to take care of every human being. And if we took care of all the human beings and they all felt safe and secure and had clean water, and they could contribute in a meaningful way and live the life they wanted to live, they probably wouldn't harm their own environment. So we just have to design a system. So when you grow up with a design education as an architect, you figure out how do you design a system where that's the case, where we can use the resources we have to design a political system, a system of relationships with nature, with the buildings we're building, with each other, with animals, with our diets, with everything that is you know, going to solve the problems that we know exist. So I look at it as a design problem, and I think some people see it maybe through the lens of what they're doing, but I do really believe that, you know, no matter what field you're in or what you're doing in food or social justice or architecture or solar panels or you know, disease prevention or whatever, it's all equally important, and it's all part of the same connected thing. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of what we do is we live in our little silos intellectually, and we don't collaborate and communicate, because we have probably all the answers. We just need to stop and talk to each other so we can work together and take the answers and figure out how to apply them in each unique situation to solve the problem. So it's been a crazy ride since losing my house, but it's also been very enlightening and humbling to feel like, well, I'm a climate refugee now, but I have it a lot better off than most of the world. But it's still it's interesting to go through it and feel the displacement and the just how much chaos it causes me, even in this country, in this city, and how much, you know, it was a challenge for my family to make it through it. So when you magnify that to what most people are facing in the world, who have less resources, you see the challenge that's before us now, to try to solve this problem before, you know, more and more people are going to experience this sort of thing. So, but I'm really excited to be here on this panel and hear what these people have to say.
Thank you very much. So John, you want to kick yourself off?
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Oops. All right. Thank you. I can't promise I'll be quite as optimistic, Brian, but I'll try, because I love the fact that we're starting at that level. I think part of it has the fact to do with probably my age and the fact that I've been spending the last 3.5, close to 4 decades working in either conflict or post-conflict situations with people who have been marginalized, people who lost their homes, or perhaps some people that never had homes to begin with, and you know, I hope I'll end here being optimistic, because I do think that there is some hope, and if we don't have hope, then we might as well just, you know, throw in the towel. So I initially started my work in conflict zones working for an organization called the International Rescue Committee, which is an organization that was started by Albert Einstein in the 1930s to help Jews get out of Europe, and it evolved into a multinational organization focused on refugees and conflict situations around the world. I first started working with them in Khartoum, Sudan, working with Eritreans and Ethiopians that had fled the war and famine there and sought refuge in Sudan. And then I went on to work in Bosnia in 1993, I guess. And ran their program there, which at the time was the largest humanitarian operation since World War II. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced from their homes. There were hundreds of thousands displaced people, and then eventually refugees as well. It was not a conflict that had a climate change component per se. It was because of ancient historical ethnic tension that eventually percolated up, and thanks to a few really bad men, resulted in a war. But I can't help but think that if in fact there had been a climate change component to it, that it certainly would have been intensified. And then I went on several years later to work with Physicians for Human Rights, as Kurt mentioned, and documented the genocide in Darfur, Sudan. Again, a case where you had ancient ethnic tensions between the Arabs and between the African people of Darfur, which is the westernmost province of Sudan, a huge swath of land about the size of Texas. And these tensions had been going on for years and years for a variety of reasons, but all of these people were forced to share the same piece of land that was shrinking as a result of climate change. As the Sahel continued to grow further and further south, you had the Arabs that were herders, and you had the African that were farmers competing for the same piece of shrinking arable land. And what we documented was just how their lives and livelihoods were being destroyed, and there were patterns. Almost every village that was attacked where you would have some sort of aerial assault, and then they would come in and they wouldn't kill people. It was genocide by attrition, largely because what they would do, they knew that because it was such a difficult climate, that if in fact they poisoned the water so there was no potable water, if they destroyed their homes and there was no shelter, and then they were thrust out into this desert death trap, that they would die, and they did die. So we documented that, and at the time we invoked a clause in the Genocide Convention that I presented at the International Criminal Court, talking about inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a certain group of people, and this is exactly what happened. Again, it wasn't murder per se, but it was a slow genocide by attrition. And so that clearly, Darfur had that climate component that perhaps Bosnia didn't. But I think as we move forward with these conflicts, whether it's ethnically or politically or motivated or not, that increasingly that climate change will play a significant role. One of the things that I'm doing now, after having been in this human rights, humanitarian space for so many years, is I got really frustrated because I felt that there was very little effort being paid attention to systemic change. That so much that was happening in terms of racial injustice, in terms of environmental injustice, economic injustice, all good and purposeful and intentional efforts, but very little of it focused on long-term sustainable systemic change. And so most of my efforts today through an organization called the Foundation for Systemic Change is really geared toward that. How do we find solutions that are systemic in nature? How do we build systems? And along with that, I think that it's crucial that we also figure out as advocates, how do we advocate on behalf of these changes? And I think it's very important to have a grassroots organizing component to that change as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Hi, everybody. Nice to see a full house here. Well, similar to Brian and to John, I very much have an interest in climate migration from a grassroots level, bottom-up approach. And this really stems from experience I had as a volunteer in Madagascar many, many moons ago, when I was very new to international development issues. And I experienced firsthand a cyclone, one that ripped the tops of palm trees off. And these people that lived all around me that had nowhere to go. There wasn't any high land, there wasn't a safe zone or safe spot for anybody, and they lost animals and lost lives. And this was really a very powerful experience for me that initially piqued my interest in how in our climate and how do we work with communities, vulnerable people all over the world, to impart skills, to foster learning and new strategies, new technologies, things that would make communities safer. I was learning, of course, I still am learning, but 30 years later, I'm still in the game, and I'm really committed to this space because I think it's the biggest issue of our time. We talk about climate change, and it's such a grandiose topic, and it's daunting. People want to kind of turn it off or run away because what the heck are you supposed to do with climate change? But at a personal level, at an individual level, and in a community, just as Brian was impacted, and just as John talks about the communities he's worked with, it is so real and profound. And in my experience, my early experience is really much of my perspective is coming from disaster management, where I started out with the U.S. government as in multiple roles, but working with the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. And then later, that was largely doing response operations all over the world and recovery operations. And during that time, I worked in different countries in Africa and mostly in Asia, and I saw repeatedly communities that were impacted by the same types of disasters again and again, and their coping strategies just depleted, and they go into debt, and they're just horrible stories. You just wonder how can anybody get out of that kind of scenario. And more and more of my focus and our funding, actually, I was able to allocate toward preparedness initiatives that were building resilience. That's the buzzword of the decade, but essentially trying to build that capacity so people can come back and be stronger for the next time a disaster strikes. So it's not so much of a disaster, it may just be a hazard they have to manage. And sadly, what I've seen over the years and what you're seeing statistically is that these disasters are getting more frequent, they're less predictable, they're having such profound impacts on people. You don't have to look very far in the news. Malawi just had a major flooding incident, and 500,000 people were displaced. And a few years ago, you can see this just in the Caribbean, we had hurricanes roll through, and again, 500,000 people displaced. So my interest really is how do we work with communities to understand climate change as a major driver, as a compounding factor for displacing yourself and your family. Most people, in my experience, do not want to leave their home. They're not looking to come to America and make it big. It's really a very traumatic experience, from what I understand, and the people I've worked with, to leave everything you know and love behind. And so I'm very interested, and I've got some good examples I hope we can touch upon, that just where people are, organizations are working with communities to help them diversify their livelihoods, as a strategy, and find safe zones and different ways to work together, as Brian was saying, to do more community planning, anticipating what's coming, what they're already experiencing. I mean, we don't need to come in and tell them that the climate's changing. When a farmer says, I plant the crop every year this time, and this year my crop it failed, I have no yield, and I have to move my family. Or the people in Bangladesh and the Delta say, what happened to my land? It flooded, we moved away, and I've got nothing to come back to. Where do these people go? And we were talking earlier too, like, in terms of conflict, I have seen it repeatedly pop up in that context. You think of Syria as a very recent example, but that has roots in drought, where people left because they were hungry. And now with COVID, we have an added layer of complexity where people were out of jobs, they couldn't move around. Those that are oftentimes most vulnerable are the ones expected to do the hard labor and expose themselves to the worst conditions. Recently I've been working with the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center on extreme heat. And very few people realize how serious extreme heat is. Our exposure, everything from basic dehydration that can be very detrimental to vulnerable people, to organ failure, kidney failure. There's more coming out, and the residual effects that can last for weeks. People losing livestock, and there's so much to unpack here. And I am also very optimistic about what's ahead, because not only do I see solutions in keeping communities where they are, nature-based solutions that retain tourism and can produce co-benefits so people can eat. If you don't cut down your mangroves, for example, you can have an environment for fish, lots of biodiversity, and you can attract tourism. Let's help people stay where they are if we can. And if they're in transit, how do we increase protection services? How do we educate people that are moving so they know what they're going to face along the way and the risks that they'll face when they get to their destination? And then how do we work with people at the landing spot? Usually it's urban, guys. I mean, World Bank says we have roughly 1 billion people in slums now, and we're looking at 3 times that by 2050. So that's where I'm focused. How do we go to these places where we know migrants are going, and we work on inclusion, and we work on protection, and we work on ways to get these people jobs, legitimate jobs. Women especially, youth especially. Not surprised, I'm talking probably to a room that's full of awareness around these issues, but that's the vulnerability. Let's reduce trafficking, exploitation, both in terms of jobs and in sexual exploitation. So there's lots of good stuff going on out there, and I hope that we can talk a little bit more about it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for your introduction. So maybe I'll start off with John, and then the others can chime in as well. You talked about sort of your focus now on systemic change, policies. Can we think about that both from a local level and sort of a broader national level as to what are some of the changes in policies and approaches that we can think about to address this?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question. I kind of approach this issue from a philanthropic perspective, and I use that term rather largely when I think of philanthropy. It's not only a wealthy individual or a foundation, but it's also the U.S. government. It's also the UN. Any entity that is funding in this funding space. And I think traditionally it's really been geared toward quick fixes and outcomes that they can show to their constituents. So you have a foundation that has a board. You have the U.S. government that has their electorate, and traditionally it's been about supporting those programs that they can where there's tangible evidence, immediate outcomes that makes them look good. I mean, it's human nature, right? But at the end of the day, if you really want to support something that's going to have a long-term sustainable effect, you have to be willing to put your money behind those efforts that are changing systems that will address those issues at hand. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and it's really, as I mentioned in my introduction, after having worked in this space I mean this human rights, humanitarian space for so many years, and seen things come completely full circle and just hitting me in the friggin' butt and thinking, my goodness, what were we thinking back then? There has to be a better way. And I think that philanthropy, and again, I define that writ large, needs a huge paradigm shift, where things focus, where this funding will focus on long-term systemic change.
Would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure, thank you. I always agree with John, because I think he's got terrific insights. In terms of an example, I think of a country or a government that's really taking progressive steps. I would say, New Zealand has always been in the forefront in looking at climate issues. They're an island nation, they're very vulnerable to a lot of different hazards, and in 2019, they actually passed a law that acknowledges climate migrants. And that's huge, from where I'm sitting, because once they're acknowledged, then these people that show up have a legitimate space and an opportunity to seek gainful employment, and whether or not it's temporary, it really doesn't matter. It's just that step alone is such a beacon of inspiration and hope for the world, because it's so urgent. It's happening all around us. Like IOM, the International Organization for Migration, they say that roughly there are some 280 million migrants right now. Migrants being people that cross borders, maybe 60 million or so internally displaced. This is woefully underestimated in my view, because who says they move? Who says they're moving because of climate? Very few people. And a lot of these people that move one time move again, like 2 weeks later, or they're hopping around, and they're not registering with anybody. They're going to see family, and then they send somebody out to get a job at this city or that city, and kind of an anchor. They establish a space around the world that eventually they'll bring other people to move in with them as a forerunner, laying down roots someplace. So I think that number is far greater, and it's impacting all of us. And if we don't acknowledge it and we don't legitimize the space and provide protections and access to services, we get horrible exploitation, even here in Colorado. We have a lot of trafficking happening right here in our backyard, in the service industry, and a lot of it's endorsed. People go into it willingly because it's an opportunity to get away from the misery they're experiencing at home. And so I think that's an example. I also think the Biden administration did something I feel very good about in helping raise awareness around extreme heat, in terms of the ag sector, the migrant workers we have farming for us, producing our food, and especially during COVID. Who was out there growing food? A lot of migrants. And these people were subjecting themselves to extreme risk on hot days. And I'm sure there were deaths affiliated. I don't have any statistics right now to throw out here, but the point being that they were putting themselves at risk. And the Biden administration was able to pass some laws that kind of add some protections around the hours that migrants or anybody working on the fields have to work, and requiring breaks where they can get adequate water and that sort of thing. So we're making steps. It's still not in the Global Compact for Migration, for safe and orderly migration that the UN is spearheading. We don't have enough in there on climate migration. Or at the COP, the climate negotiations, people are talking about climate migration, but until we really look at it as a category of people and legitimize that as a reason for displacement, I think we're always going to be trying to catch up to the problem.
We were discussing earlier, Rebecca and I, about the idea of climate migration, and somebody leaves their home because it's flooded, or because for economic reasons, or whatever, but they don't necessarily self-identify as climate refugees, and when in fact they are. But it also gets to the point of how it's kind of difficult to measure what role climate plays per se, even though it's obvious it's a role, but to actually use that as a metric, I think is a difficult one.
So, Brian, one of the things I was thinking about in your introduction that relates to this as well is how the built environment gets built, the regulatory constraints, the zoning constraints, and how policies around that, about how we do, I mean, we build what zoning tells us to build, in a sense. And how do we create innovation in that type of environment? And I know in experience that you and I shared, the city of Louisville had just passed, some would say aggressive policies, building policies around sustainable building a month before the fire. The fire occurred, and then everyone was like, oh my God, what did we just do? Now we're going to have to build to that standard. And how do you deal with the bringing the community along in some of that work?
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on, I think, what I started with, and, talking about what John and Rebecca were talking about, the being able to recognize that we need to acknowledge that we're probably all climate refugees now. The planet's changed for everybody, not just a few people. And it's just a matter of time before it impacts you, or how much it impacts you, or how directly, but it's happening to all of us. So we're all in that category. And we need to recognize those people, and we need to recognize that, those institutions have to change. And zoning is one of those things that's kind of, I mean, if you look at the history of zoning, it's classically been used to discriminate, right? To keep people down. Who are economically or socially disadvantaged in the first place, and so it's been used as a tool of discrimination classically. So if you can turn that around now and say, well, how can we change our policies? And once we acknowledge that too, that we say, okay, well, this set of regulations and this culture we've built up, not only institutional government around it, but also a culture of exclusion and in zoning. How can we turn that around and turn this into a policy now that's inclusionary, that gives people opportunity? Because housing, I think, is a right for everyone, and so it's going to require major systemic change. So yeah, not just like you're saying, election cycle. We're going to fund something that's an energy efficiency program that expires in 2 years, or a tax credit for geothermal that's 3 years or 10 years. That's just scratching the surface. What you need to is address the fundamental kind of infrastructural regulatory, limits that are keeping people from being able to afford housing, and that is essentially zoning. We need more flexible, I would say, not necessarily density, because I think that turns into like it's not the right word, but flexible zoning that acknowledges the true needs of people to have a community, to have resources, to have access to goods and services, to have access to affordable transportation. I always say I don't think electric cars can save the world, but I think maybe electric bikes or skateboards or single wheels or some of these really micro mobility things can really empower people that struggle to get water or food. And now they can have a device that you can ship in a box that can get them 20 miles an hour, and you can charge it with a solar panel on your backpack. And so that to me is exciting technology. But you've got to also provide housing that looks like the people that you're trying to house. And so we're still making housing based on this single family identity that doesn't even match, at all what the demographic looks like of real people. So we need to make, housing that looks like the people that we're providing housing for, and we need to make it with those people. So yeah, when we think of even our local community as Boulder or Louisville being progressive, I think it's not really, because we're still entrenched in these ideas that are 50, 60 years old and rooted in racism and exclusionary principles. So once we acknowledge that, then we can say, well, what's the change? What's the policy we need to make? And if that policy comes out of compassion and love, it's very simple. It's just like, well, who needs housing, and how do we get them what they need? And it doesn't matter what the rules say. We just need to make the housing that people need where they need it. And I think with the climate change, we need to be quicker on our feet, because, these things globally are going to be, we have to do it faster, but we also have to do it in a way that's more resilient and sustainable and durable too. It can't be cheap things. We have to withstand extreme heat, so it has to be insulated. It has to be safe and secure. So it's a daunting task, but I think it's going to look smaller. It's going to look more mobile. It's going to look more modest, but it's also going to be more community-oriented and happy and joyful, because it'll bring us together more instead of putting us alone. on these little parcels with our little fences, it's going to bring us together, I think, in more dynamic and interesting ways. And it's going to look different everywhere because it's going to come from, ideally, the community of people that it's serving. So it's going to be user designed to some degree. I was in Brazil in '99 to study sustainable urban planning in Curitiba, Brazil. They did some amazing policy things around buses because they couldn't afford subways. So they just, Jamie Lerner, the mayor, was an architect. So he said, well, we'll just have money, or people pay the money to get in a glass tube, and then when the bus comes, they can just flood onto the tube instead of waiting for everyone to go up the steps and put in their 45 cents or whatever. It was like a subway, but it didn't cost what a subway cost. And then they had areas that were flooding, and so they took those areas and they bought out the farmers that were, subsistence farming or kept getting flooded out. And they said, we're going to turn this into a city park. Then we can have wealthy residents buy properties along the city park to pay for it, and the city gets a park. They eliminate the flood risk, and then the farmers actually can have enough money to go and, go somewhere else, and they get paid well. Enough to start anew. So there was a bunch of creative policy, but also just looking at the favelas and the slums, you just see creativity in material use, and you see people surviving in crazy ways, but it's much more interesting architecturally because it's like, this is kind of the way human beings are meant to be. We're meant to be clever and creative and not be so constrained by policy that's 40, 50 years old. So we have to make policy turn over quicker. So it has to be more adaptable, and it can't take so long to change, but it also has to be, I think, it's also, you're trying to make things more durable, more sustainable, and not, I think what's happening in Louisville is that people are trying to build the same zoning idea they were building before, a 3,000 square foot single family house, and they're like, well, we can't afford it. But I was like, well, what you could afford is maybe a 2,000 or 1,500 square foot house, and if you could build another unit of housing on your property, now you could really afford it, and you could make that work economically, even with inflation, even with COVID pricing. But you've got to change that zone. You got to flip that zoning switch, and then now suddenly the economics work. But if you don't change the zoning, it looks impossible to these people. So that's why there was a rebellion in Louisville, and they, didn't want to build more energy efficient buildings. And so now we're rebuilding the same, climate change causing problem buildings potentially, and some of these projects that use gas that we had before, instead of a net zero or a plus energy electrically driven building with lots of insulation that houses more people on the same amount of land with maybe less water use and less land use. So there's a lot of chance for innovation, but we've got to get the policy to work. We have to change the regulation.
So I'm gonna pause for a second. I want everyone to raise their right hand. Okay. If you don't have a question, you can lower your hand. Like a few more questions, so thanks for keeping your hands up. Someone will bring you a card. Thank you. I'm gonna talk about a similar, with this policy conversation, an experience that I had where it really opened my eyes to the impact that national policy can have. It was a little bit different, related to health. I was working in South Africa, and we were running about 180 HIV clinics around the country, and doing a lot of prevention work. And the Bush administration had started this PEPFAR program, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, an amazing program. And but the prevention program, and what we were only required to do, was to talk about abstinence. And so on the African continent, that was our message. And if we wanted money, that's what we had to talk about. President Obama, you may remember, was elected. And 2 weeks after his election, we got this letter from USAID. And they said, we're changing direction. We're going to start talking about family planning. And so it changed our whole approach. And after about a year of this, and we got great data on a lot of this, now there was a lot more condoms that were going out, a lot more protection. And And studies in South Africa had shown that about 65% of intercourse was actually a transaction for someone to pay school fees, to pay rent. And by having more protection, the transmission of HIV was reducing to women. As a result, it was also reducing the birth rates. And it's had an amazing impact. And I was just so inspired at that point to learn how, following this data related to a policy had significant impact. And I'm hoping in this kind of realm we can start to experience that as well. There was one question here to John, and it says, what was the result or outcome of your case at the ICC?
Oh, great question. So I had mentioned that this documentation that I did with Physicians for Human Rights when I went to Darfur, Sudan, a number of times, and came back with what we called a livelihood study. What was, I mentioned sort of the pattern of destruction in the various villages throughout Sudan that was propelled by climate change. And we came to the conclusion, as I mentioned, that genocide was being committed there by the Sudanese government, and we presented our findings to the ICC. And while I don't know for sure, and again, it was done in a way where we documented, how these villages were systematically destroyed first by aerial bombings, and then going in and destroying the homes and then poisoning the wells. And the livestock was critical in terms of killing the livestock, and these people were just thrust out into the desert. But we also had documentation that it was that there was intent by the government, and this is what I presented to the ICC. And in fact, they did use this evidence in the indictment of the genocide indictment of the former president of Sudan, al-Bashir. So, and he was indicted for genocide. But it's like anything. It's hard to, detect, whether or not. I mean, I'm sure that this evidence had played some sort of role in that indictment, but whether it was, what role it played, I'm not sure.
Thank you. I've got a couple questions I'm going to combine to Brian specifically, and then I'll get back to a question for the whole group. So tell us what a passive house is, and how do contractors and developers get on board with the zoning changes that you're dreaming about?
Well, the first one's easy. The second one's pretty hard. Well, yeah. So I'll define passive house. It came from Germany initially. It was Darmstadt University, Bo Adamson, a Swedish professor, and then Wolfgang Feist. And basically, they built an Excel spreadsheet to calculate how much energy a house used, and they were very detailed. It was an academic student project, right? So you had time to really nerd out and figure out how much energy went through a window frame and how much energy you lost through leaks in your house under your windowsills and your front door and everything. So they figured if they made a building airtight, and if they super insulated and got rid of all the thermal bridging. So if you look at it, now even you can buy for your iPhone a little FLIR thermal camera, and you can see, heat loss. And for just a few $100s or something, you can get one of these cameras. But that'll teach you everything you need to know for passive house. It's like a styrofoam cooler, essentially, for a building. So you're not wasting energy heating and cooling a building that just by better thermodynamics, right? Super basic physics, right? Stuff that we've known for a long time. We just haven't been building our buildings that way. So they created an energy standard, and it's kind of grown internationally. But initially, it was made for taking old European multi-story masonry buildings, stone or concrete buildings, right, that are super uncomfortable to be in, that had boilers, and they would get rid of the boilers, and they would super insulate the outside with like 8 inches of styrofoam or 8 inches of mineral wool, or you could use straw bale or cellulose or whatever you wanted. Just something has low conductivity. And then they would replace all the windows with, take away the metal single pane windows from the, ancient history and replace them with triple glazed super insulated windows that were maybe R10 instead of R1. And then they could just supply all the heat and cooling they needed through the ventilation system. So that's where the name passive house comes from, because there's no active heating system. It's just your body heat basically heating these apartments. It doesn't work so well for a single family house, like in very cold climates, because now you've got, maybe 2 people and you've got a lot of surface area, and the German climate's more mild than, say northern Canada or whatever. But so it's not totally internationally applicable, but the concept is, which is that you're going to use little to no energy for heating and cooling. And I think that building science now exists for pretty much all the climates everywhere. So whether you have a dehumidification climate in the deep south, whether you have an extreme heating climate like Alaska, or an extreme cooling climate like Arizona or something, it works. The principles, the physics principles, work everywhere. So it's essentially just a lot of 50% of, if you can look at that term grossly, goes to the built environment for heating, cooling, procuring buildings. There's 50% of the climate problem. Well, then a big chunk of that is just heating and cooling our buildings, and if we do them right, we don't need to use any energy really to do that, or we can drive all of that renewably globally. So we can get rid of that part of the carbon problem just by better physics. So it's not, I don't even think it takes necessarily lots of money, but it takes more ingenuity and more people working on it, and being thoughtful and knowing it. So it's more of an education problem. And then how do we change the zoning or get the policy? It might be harder in the US. I think what was cool in Brazil was that, it's a different government structure. So they were just able to kind of do these things, right? And here, we have city and local and state government. I mean, I know now with, Polis is looking at this, statewide kind of zoning mandate to allow housing. And I think that's kind of the future, is that, yes, I believe in local control, but, sometimes, on these larger global issues, maybe we have to have a bigger picture, because it's hard to just do this incrementally. We have to do it systemically. So some of these things where I think it comes down to a right to housing, or a right to clean water, or a right to being safe, and these things are just basic human rights. So it's not really like a neighborhood aesthetic policy that we can hang our hats on. It's got to be, we have to make the connection that this is a bigger thing. So I don't really know, but I welcome anybody who works in policy to talk about how to, because it's entrenched, I think, a little bit in our culture to some degree, but it's also very new, right? 100 years ago we had walkable cities because we didn't have cars, and really the zoning was based on post-World War II exodus from cities. So it's actually really new to as a species to have this weird zoning problem, because we used to build low energy communities because we didn't have fossil fuels, but then once we had fossil fuels, we kind of lost the sort of intuitive, it's heavy to like lift things and take them miles and miles to our house. Like, we're just going to live close together, but now it's easy, so we just tend to make things, we're not thinking through that. So I don't know. I'm curious what these guys think about how to, what are the policy changes
how to
globally?
affect zoning laws. I could go on and about, and I'm sure there was a lot of community organizing going on. I don't know what exactly happened, but I think education plays an enormous role. It sounds like there was a mindset, and that's really hard to go against. I think you need from a very holistic attempt to educate people, starting with young people. It'd be really interesting to me. I have no idea how textbooks look at, let's say, conflict, what I know something about, and whether climate change plays a role in any, let's say 8th grade history lesson about a particular climate, a particular conflict. I would tend to think maybe not. I don't know. You're a mother of young children, whether that, but for me, it starts there. And that's the hard thing, because it is a slow process, but it really is about a paradigm shift that's necessary, I think, in our education. And my goodness, right now, suggest to some states that their curriculums and textbooks should focus on climate change vis-a-vis, I mean, that's up. But I do think that the idea of grassroots organizing is critical to that type of change.
I would just add real quick, because I think you got other questions. From my perspective, not a policy guru, but I think it comes down to incentives and sometimes broaching the topic in a safe space that doesn't have to do directly with architecture or the zoning, but you rather come in on a, hey, we got extreme heat. How do we address extreme heat? An example of this is in Chennai, India, we were working on a mobile gardening program for migrants and poor women and youth in the area surrounding the inner city. And they got an immediate food source that was producing food in as little as 3 weeks, and they got a way to cool off their home. So they could aggregate these little pots of, greenery, producing whole organic food, and they could aggregate them on their rooftops. They could aggregate them on their windowsills and in the front of their homes. And, we're looking at replicating a rooftop garden model. But rooftop gardening is very complicated and expensive and a heavy load on a lot of buildings. So I think this whole space of nature-based solutions for architecture is phenomenal. And I don't know if any of you have been to Bangkok lately, but it's really cool to see all the green they have going down the sides of the buildings. I mean, obviously they get a lot of rain. It's not Colorado. But if we had more incentives to use nature around us to help cool our homes and low-cost, no-cost type interventions. That's what I think. So it's accessible to people and it's something you can scale.
But I also think, to reiterate what Brian said in terms of advocacy, the role of human, I have to say this because this is what I've been doing for the last 40 years, the role of human rights is critical, and it can take that kind of political element out of it and that partisan element out of it. If you're talking about the rights to housing, these are all fundamental, rights that are codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that that can sometimes cover for tension that's more political in nature than otherwise. So I think that human rights angle is really important.
So I'm going to target this to you, Rebecca. There's been several questions here about migration, immigration, border walls. How do you see that in the context of these climate challenges? What are some solutions or policy approaches around that?
Yeah, thank you, Kurt. Well, I think every context is so different, but moving, our world moving, it's like water. You're not keeping it out with a wall. You're not going to. Sea walls, for example, like eventually the ocean's going to win, right? And so I think creating space to accommodate in a way that accepts diversity and recognizes the contribution of migrants or immigrants. I think, the U.S. is built on this, right? The innovation we talk about, Brian works with a German company, for example. All this technology that we have right now is a phenomenal space for us to explore, to be more inclusive, and to allow that transfer of knowledge and skills that helps us be a better nation and the world writ large. So people can work in different places and have economic security, but they're contributing. I mentioned Chennai again. I'll use that example again. The program that we were doing there brought out the fact that roughly 30% of that local GDP comes from people that were displaced, that live in those slums. That's phenomenal to me. I had no idea. So I think, when we look at the policies that are in place, if we can be a little more accepting and lenient, for example, in work permits and allowing people space to contribute, and even with remote working, it doesn't even have to, you can still do that and have people in different countries, but harnessing that knowledge and skill transfer that we talk about in education and otherwise, I just think it opens up the whole world, literally. So that's one area. And then I think this whole notion of diversifying your income streams, particularly for women who are largely the ones, the primary caregivers, right, for children. And data shows that they reinvest in those kids. And so we have all sorts of things you can invest in education. There's lots of things toward, your philosophy toward international development where you could prioritize different aspects. But I think really if we look at basic human needs, people need to put food on the table. They want a safe roof over their head. And whatever that looks like, if we can meet those basic needs, I think there's contribution and innovation that comes from that. So this is kind of where I start, like get those basic needs met. If people are uprooted, help them get settled, and look at the real drivers behind that migration. Can you avert some of the migration from the beginning so people can stay where they are safely? Like Cambodia, 15 years ago, I was going through a project that USAID was supporting with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and they have all these homes on stilts. People know what to do. In Nepal, where I worked there for some time, the buildings were constructed so the windows they extended, and you probably have all the terminology from architecture, but they were ready for earthquakes, they were ready for flooding, and we've lost a lot of that knowledge just from trying to expedite construction and building into parts of cities that are too steep, they're not meant to be built on, right? So increasing our awareness, going back to traditional building methodologies that might be more appropriate. But largely, I think in this technology space and in the livelihoods area, they're related.
So one of the things I was prompted on is that we have to end on time. So we've got about 6 minutes left, I think. I would like each of you to take 2 minutes. In some way, you've depressed us a little bit. But how
I'm surrounded by two optimists here. They need to talk.
This is uplifting.
No, but what uplifts you, and what is your approach to tackling some pretty overwhelming challenges? So no more than 2 minutes each. And Brian, why don't you start us off?
Okay. I guess when I grew up, I liked just making things, and I had Legos, and I played with blocks, and I played in the mud, and I liked building stuff. And then when I went to college, I learned in my sophomore year, architecture is 50% of the climate problem, and we have a climate problem, because I didn't learn that in high school. I didn't learn that until I went to college at University of Oregon. So I found like my life mission. So I feel like I felt like I found something that I could contribute. And it was scary, and I definitely went through depression in college reading all these books about the situation. I got really depressed, and it was Oregon, so it rained a lot, so that's probably part of the problem too. If you grow up here, your vitamin D is solid, and then you go there, and it's it's a problem. But when I came back, I think some of that optimism, the why don't things just change? You start learning more about how the world is really set up and all the reasons why things are the way they are. And so you've got to be humble. But I do think, like I said, I get excited by the students, and now even some of my students that I've worked with, or people that have worked for me, are doing really cool stuff, like way cooler stuff than we're doing. And that makes me really excited, because I'm like, I'm not even that old, and some of these kids are doing cool things, So young people, I think the good news about being young is you're not burdened by pessimism from, or like, you don't know any better, right? So you're going to go out and be like, I can do anything, and which is great. And then the great thing about being old is that you have some wisdom, be like, well, these things probably aren't going to work, but this surgically might work because I've been around long enough, I've made enough mistakes. And so the blending of those things, so old people need to listen to young people and their optimism. Young people need to, also I was arrogant, coming out of college, and so young people need to be humble because you don't know it all. You think you might after college, but so anyway, so I think if we all just work together, I really do. It's the cross collaboration, the education, and all these wonderful creative ideas you guys have told me about. I think that's what's exciting, and it keeps me going. Even though, when you look at the numbers, it's super depressing.
So Brian, I'm glad that you're no longer arrogant. I was really excited to hear that. John?
Super arrogant.
Yeah,
Two
I don't
minutes?
have much to add. I think everything that Brian said is right. This movement is being led by kids, right, by young people, and it should be. But regrettably, the rest of the world is controlled by older people who may not get it. So I do think that the the role that young people as advocates can play is critical, but it's the, the policies writ large that need to change, and so there needs to be a more amplification process globally, and from this, from addressing this particular issue, and a more, holistic, as I call it, strategy that affects everybody beyond borders, because it's such a borderless problem. But I think the combination of youth as advocates and then being able to work, and you have evidence of it all over the place, but that's what needs to get out there, amplifying those places where policies have changed and where systemic change has been, and not necessarily a law has been implemented or whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to be a legal measure, but it can be one that's supported by the community and advocated by the community and implemented by the community. So I'm really encouraged by those efforts. But the most difficult thing about this issue, I think, is it's global one in nature, and that requires a completely holistic strategy that one that we've never seen before.
So Rebecca, you want to close us out?
Sure,
Thank you.
I'll be brief. I mean, I think everything stems from human ingenuity. Really is sparked among youth, and so I am right there with John and Brian on this. But to be a little more specific, maybe I'll give a couple examples. I would really focus my time and effort, if I were 20-something again, looking at financial independence for at-risk communities, for at-risk youth and at-risk women, and focusing on that, and simultaneously really looking at climate-smart livelihoods. What can people do to give these at-risk people an edge up, instead of like being at the bottom of the ladder? Put them at the front. Can we train women in how to best use solar energy or wind energy, and impart skills that could really advance their success and contribution to their own well-being in their household, and then beyond that, in their communities. So I think just having a real emphasis on climate-smart livelihoods. And there's all sorts of stuff in that space, guys. I mean, and even, we have to think about natural resources as a financially, viable space, right? So we always talk about conservation. And when I worked at the Nature Conservancy, I really advocated for a nature protects people strategy that talked about co-benefits and how people could actually make money. By conserving that mangrove, you're going to be able to fish and provide food for people, or you'll have more tourism. And that's a good thing, as long as you care for your resources sustainably. And anyway, so I'll stop there. 2 minutes ago.
So I want to thank you as an audience. You've given us great questions. I appreciate that. I want to thank the panel for their great insight and wisdom and conversation. And let's give the panel a hand. Thank you. Enjoy your next session, and I'll be relying on the youth going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great. Wow. Yeah, you too. Amazing.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.